bonjour, ciao, and welcome back to my channel. Now in this video I'm going to be focusing on a really interesting case study where medicine has gone wrong. Now this is called the Elephant Man trial, and it's named as a result of the sort of after effects of this trial. On the 13th of March in 2006, eight healthy men took part in a clinical drug trial for the drug TGN-1412. Now before I get into the nitty-gritty about the details of this trial and this drug, I wanted to talk to you about the basics when it comes to clinical trials and how drugs are manufactured and what steps it requires to license the drugs so that they're appropriate for use on a global level. Clinical trials are used to ensure that the drug in question, first of all, works. This is called efficacy, and it also needs to be checked so that you can work out the optimum dosage as well as figuring out what potential side effects this drug may have. When it comes to clinical trials, this is done after a few other tests and experiments beforehand. So before you can test drugs on humans, it's usually tested on healthy cells and tissues and sometimes even animals before it can reach the human, trial stage. And that's really important to ensure that the overall effects aren't too toxic or nasty, because it could potentially lead to fatal effects. So clinical trials first begin with a small number of healthy patients. Now this is coined phase 1 or phase 0 in some particular trials, and it's essentially used to ensure that the drug that you were testing, reaches its target area and actually has some form of therapeutic use or at least some preventative use. There's no point in licensing a drug if it can't even reach that first stage in a way. So phase 1/phase 0 is very important to meet to ensure that the drug is at least safe on a minimum level in a way. Usually involves a really small number of people, let's say about maybe under 20 or 20 to 50 under 20 people, just to ensure that all the things that I mentioned beforehand are acceptable and are safe enough to use. Now once this part of the trial has been succeeded and it's okay, then you can move on to what is called phase 2. Now phase 2 usually involves more people and sometimes includes those with the condition that the drug is aiming to treat. This is so that you can identify the effectiveness of the drug and figure out an appropriate dosage, because you want to know what dosage is too much or too little so that it can still elicit the response that you intend it to do. At this stage, sometimes a placebo may be used, and a placebo is essentially a substance that actually has no effect whatsoever. So it's used to compare the drug you're testing to the people who don't have the drug to see whether or not the drug is effective or actually does what it needs to do. So the placebo itself has no form of therapeutic value, so it's a really good use of testing or comparing the drug you're testing to see if it works or not. And usually in phase 2, about, let's say, 100 or so people will be involved just to see how it's useful and to check all the necessary things I said beforehand. Phase 3 is sometimes considered to be the last phase, but there's always more phases that people could potentially use in the future. But phase 3 involves hundreds, if not thousands, of people to confirm the effective dosage of the drug and to also confirm whether or not that drug is safe and effective. So once you've hit phases 0/1 to 2 and you've hit phase 3, then usually you can sort of figure out what the right form of drug you can use, or as well as the right dosage, and then you can potentially look into considering whether or not this drug is safe enough to be licensed for general use. Now sometimes this phase 3, can be used to compare the drug you're testing to a drug that may potentially already be on sale and licensed, just to see if this drug you're testing is better or not as effective, etc. So going through all of these phases and all of these trials is so very important, because it ensures that the drugs that are put out on sale and licensed are actually safe to use. So as I've said many times, it is so important that clinical trials take place to ensure that drugs are safe to use, and an emphasis on safe, because you want to make sure that whatever you're giving your patients actually works and helps them, rather than the opposite way round. Now the TGN-1412 or the Elephant Man trials is a really key example of where a clinical trial had gone wrong. TGN-1412, otherwise known as ferrolizumab, was a drug that was hoped to have been used to help treat leukemia and rheumatoid arthritis. It was trialed by an American company called Parexel, and it was entering its clinical trial phases essentially. So it was about to enter its phase 1/phase 0 trial. This drug had successfully been treated on monkeys beforehand, so before the clinical trials even took place, there were really high hopes for this drug to be effective in treating leukemia and rheumatoid arthritis. So 8 men between the ages of 19 and 34 were split into 2 groups for phase 1 of this clinical trial. 1 person in each of those groups was to receive a placebo, but no one, including the clinicians and the patients, would know who had received the placebo. Now, this is called a double-blind trial, and it's used a lot to ensure that the trials that are used are fair and unbiased, because you don't want to necessarily know that there's a potential stark difference when it comes to using the placebo and using the drug. You just want to know that it happens like by its own accord, rather than having other people interfering with those results. These men were administered the drug or the placebo, we don't know at that point, and they were done so intravenously, with each man receiving a dose of the drug/placebo 10 minutes apart. David Oakley was patient number 1, and he was the first to receive the drug, and soon he complained about a headache. Now, the problem was, because he was taking part in a clinical drug trial, he could not take paracetamol, ibuprofen, or any other form of drug to help relieve his headache, because it would have otherwise intervened with the trial. So instead, all he received was a cold compress to try and help his headache. However, that didn't help him or work. Very soon after, more pain ensued, and he ended up receiving, or sort of feeling, really severe back pain. He described the pain that he was experiencing as being horrible. For the other men in Oakley's group, it was a waiting game. Now, you have to remember that these men were receiving the drug in 10-minute doses, so after watching David's pain, it was a matter of whether or not they would be next. So it was terrifying, I assume, in that instance, because you wanted to know whether or not you had received the drug that was causing Oakley's pain, or if you had received a placebo and would be considered to be sort of safe. Race Khan at the time of the clinical trial was 23, and he found the whole experience to be daunting and extremely scary. He eventually found that he was the one who received the placebo, because he didn't endure the same level of pain as his fellow colleagues had done during the clinical trial. Rob Oldfield, patient number 7, said that he felt as though he was being dipped into ice, as in freezing cold ice. He received the drug almost an hour after patient number 1, and I don't even want to imagine the sort of pain that those men were enduring during that trial, because it must have been horrific. One thing that I find really interesting when it comes to clinical trials is that a lot of people take part in these trials because they are offered a form of compensation in the form of money. So these men believe that if they were to take part in this trial, they would be able to form easy money and contribute to advancing the medical field. And a lot of people are right to assume that and think that, because there are many instances when clinical trials do go correct and they go fine, and people just get the money and they just go about the rest of their lives with like no second thought. However, this clinical trial went wrong so quickly. It took place, I forgot to mention, in Norfolk Park Hospital in northwest London, and it's now considered to be one of the most infamous medical emergencies ever, and it's got so many documentaries, so many dramatization and interviews as a result of it, because the effects were insane. After the headaches and the feeling like being dipped into ice, many of the men who had received, if not all of the men who had received the TGN-1412 drug, had organs start to fail. Their heads were swelling, and many were projectile vomiting, and Race, one of the patients who'd received a placebo, had compared it to being in a horror movie. Now, the head swelling, the body swelling is what allowed the Elephant Man trial to be called what it is, because their figures had swelled so much that you couldn't really identify who they were, because they had just ballooned up in their appearances, so they were compared to the Elephant Man essentially. Now, the drug had caused their immune systems to completely shut down, and some of the men had to be taken into intensive care as a result. The doctors and consultants, meanwhile, didn't understand the cause of everyone's pain and what had gone wrong. They'd assumed the pain would only disappear after a short while, but it only continued to get worse and worse. The symptoms were reflective of a really severe immune reaction called a cytokine storm. However, it also replicated that of a result of infection. Now, the treatments for a cytokine storm and an infection are very different. So the physicians had a choice of what potential treatment to give these men. Now, if they had given the men the wrong form of treatment, it would have been fatal. And it would have caused severe effects. So it was a guessing game, and physicians eventually decided to treat the men as if they were experiencing a cytokine storm. So the men who had received the TGN-1412 drug had been administered significant doses of steroid, and at that moment all that was left to do was to wait and pray, because they just didn't know what could potentially happen. The families of these patients were informed of the event and were told that this could potentially be their final goodbye with their loved ones and their relatives. Imagine that. That's just, thinking about it now, it's just so, it's surreal and it's so terrifying to have experienced that, not knowing whether or not this would be the last moment with your loved one. It's just wow. Luckily, the steroids were sort of the right choice to give to these men. It took a while for them to eventually get better, but even then they were still very weak and their immune systems had completely depleted. One of the men, Ryan Wilson, had to spend a further 4 months in hospital due to the trial. His fingers and parts of his feet had to be amputated as a result of necrosis. Now, necrosis is when you just have death of body tissue, and this process can't be reversed. So once necrosis happens, that is it. He had to fight symptoms of pneumonia, which is an infection of the lungs, septicemia, which is an infection of the bloodstream, and dry gangrene, which is caused by blood not reaching a part of the body because it's blocked. And this causes skin to turn blue, brown, black, all forms of colour, just to indicate that part of the body is dying. As a result of this trial, a number of investigations had to take place to see why these detrimental effects occurred to these men. Now, after investigation, it was found that the drugs administered to these men was done so 10 times more quickly than it had done to the monkeys. The investigation and the reports that followed paved the way for recommendations as to how to actually carry out phase 1 trials better and improve the overall process of these clinical trials. This includes not allowing volunteers to be dosed all in the same day like the elephant men had done, because they had received those drugs all on the same day within 10-minute intervals. So all the recommendations and the guidelines that applied as a result of this investigation are now applied all throughout Europe, and that's so necessary to ensure that these clinical trials are now done so appropriately and safely. The company that actually manufactured the drug, called Tolu, went bust after the TGN-1412 trial, and that's understandable because it caused so much havoc. Compensation had to be given to the trial, and even though it took a really long time to do so, it eventually happened. Despite the detrimental effects that the drug caused, a Russian company actually ended up buying the rights to the TGN-1412 drug, and instead they renamed it to Tab 08. Now, trials were conducted again with this drug, however done so at doses that were 5% that given to the men in the Elephant Man trial. Now, that drug could potentially be used in the future, however right now I am not in a position to know whether or not it will be effective, but we just have to wait and see what happens in the future. But the Elephant Man trial was just surreal and shocking, and I hope that this video has given you some insight into what happened with that trial and potentially has sparked some interest in the processes involved in clinical trials and how drugs are manufactured. But hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!